morning. Welcome to the Slowtwitch Podcast. I'm Ryan Heisler, Slowtwitch Editor-in-Chief, joined, as almost all episodes will be, by our leading partner, Eric Wynn.
Hello. So, Ryan, is this your radio voice? What
This isn't my,
do you
it's
change your
my
voice for this, or do you
broadcast
just talk?
voice. I
You
suppose,
do have a good broadcast voice.
I was told I had a face for radio when I was looking at colleges, so that was outstanding. But this is something that has kind of been in the background for the last 20 years. Like, my undergraduate is in broadcast journalism, so this is right in my wheelhouse.
Nice. So, why are we starting one of these? There's so many podcasts out there.
There's a ton of podcasts, and we appreciate everybody taking the time to go ahead and listen to ours, right? And hopefully this first episode doesn't immediately dissuade them from continuing to listen to our podcast. But, this is kind of one of our pet projects as we really look at Slowtwitch generally on, where people want to be able to consume content. And at the end of the day, we want to be where people prefer to consume anything. And some of that's going to be on the main site, and some of that's going to be audio content, and some of that's the video stuff that you've really been spearheading the charge on for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think where we're going to be able to really dive deep in this is it's not a themed podcast at all. It seems like there's a lot of themed podcasts out there that are very specific. We have an opportunity, I think, to be very general with what we are talking about. We've also got a huge Rolodex of people that we can tie into when we want to talk about specific things. When we want to dive in a little bit deeper, the one thing that I really like about the idea of a podcast is I'm not the greatest writer. And so it gives me an opportunity to talk about things that are very important to me and what I feel like are important to our sport and our community in a way that is easier for me to be able to communicate. And so that's one thing that I am really excited about when it comes to podcasting is being able to dive a little bit deeper and get just the emotions of being able to talk to guests when they're on. I remember talking with my buddy Gilad, it was on the phone like a couple of months ago. And we talked like 45 minutes about the early days of Normatech. And it reminded me again of why it was important for us to start a podcast, because there's no way we could have possibly got all that information into an article that people actually wanted to read, but they sure would have listened to it. So,
yeah. And I think one thing is that it's often easier to convey human emotion in an audio or a visual format, right? Like, because you're getting so many different cues off of somebody when you're able to see them or hear them. That's not to say, right, like, I've always written, right? Like, writing is in my blood, and it's not like that's going to go anywhere. It's just about, like, how are the various ways that we can reach people and be able to help someone, potentially tell a story, right? Like, some people are going to be great writers, and some people are going to be great in this format. And some people are going to be terrible in this format, and that's okay. Like, we just want to give people the best opportunity to be able to help shape and tell their stories in the best way that we can. And to your point, like, the thing that I love about this is that we get to be pretty free flowing and conversational, and it's not quite the same as, when we're writing a news article, right? Like, there's pretty strict, like, drilled into my head Associated Press style formatting that we have to follow. Like, there are certain rules of that. there's less rules for this, which is awesome.
We can tell
And that
people that they suck on this podcast, is what you're saying.
yes,
Yes. Yeah.
including myself sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
I mean, but
We can also swear.
I mean, when I have to,
Okay.
right? Like,
Yeah.
use them sporadically. But the the cool thing is that because we're not tied to a particular topic or theme, like as stuff pops up, like we're going to be able to pivot and say, "Hey, we want to talk about this right now," because that's what's most interesting to us.
Yeah. So, speaking of talking about things that we want to talk about, I think one of the topics we wanted to cover today was just kind of the current state of Slow Twitch as a whole, and what our plans are, for the future, based on what the current state of Slow Twitch is. In your opinion, you've been working full time for Slow Twitch for a lot longer than I have. Where would you say that the current state of Slow Twitch is right now?
Um, so it's interesting, like it's really kind of an interesting place to be in, right? Because outside of Dan, I probably have the most tenure on Slow Twitch, out of anybody who's contributing to the site today. And if you told me that that would be the case 8 years ago, right around this time, like I would have laughed in your face. Um, because, at that point in time, like I had been doing stuff with the real Starkey and TRS radio. And like now is when the whole Kona lottery thing blew up. Um, and so, like I sat on the forums and took my beating as kind of the quote unquote face of, you know, having written a form letter to the Florida Department of Justice being like, how is this legal? And then, 6 months later, there's this thing. So whether or not like I actually had any role in it is, up for debate. But what I did do is sit on the forum and eat a lot of shit from people who were pissed, right? Um, and I had my 15 minutes in the sun on the front page of Slow Twitch because Dan wrote an article like about it. And I guess it was just that moment in time where Dan was like, you have a lot of integrity over the fact that like you stood there and took your shit. And I disagree with, the way that you did this, but, like good on you for like just coming on. And 6 months later, I started writing for Slow Twitch, um, which was always just kind of like a really interesting pivot. But where we sit as Slow Twitch right now is in kind of a little bit of a transition period, right? We're um we're in that moment in time where we know the direction that we want to go in. We have a lot of existing ways that we've done things and produced content and told stories. Um, and we have, this incredibly active forum, um, which, gives us a lot of community member conversation and everything else. Um, but, we we're along for the ride with the state of the entirety of the industry, right? And we're still all kind of emerging from the pandemic and the economic realities that are out there right now. So we're in this phase where we're running with all the stuff that we have classically done, which is produce really compelling articles. um, but now we're at that phase where we're trying to crawl essentially with some of the other kinds of stories that we want to develop, tell, and be able to put out there.
Yeah, and that was part of the plan. When we had an opportunity to acquire Slow Twitch from Dan, back in October of 2022, it was. Um, I've known Dan for 9 years, and we had always talked about this idea of being able to take it over from him. and it definitely happened faster than he and I thought it was going to happen. And when it did happen, it was pretty quick. And so, when it came to the due diligence process and whatnot, it was about 3 weeks that we agreed on, which really, if anyone's ever purchased a company, particularly a company with 20 plus years of history, there's no way you can dive deep into a lot of things. It's really at that point you're trusting the other person isn't feeding you a bunch of shit on financial numbers and records and all of that things. And because Dan and I have developed a long history of trust with each other, particularly I think our trust is because we are very different when it comes to political views and things like that, but we've always just trusted each other that no matter what, we're going to look out for each other's best interests, even if we disagree on certain points. And so, moving into the first year, our goal was, and my goal was really very simple. It was two things. Number one, don't piss Dan off. So in other words, let Dan be Dan.
Yep.
There's a reason why Slowtwitch has been a beacon in the sport when it comes to, from a news perspective, is it's because of Dan Enfield. And so, really to just give him carte blanche on, hey, you're still the publisher, do what you want. I'm not getting in your way. And then the other thing was to figure out exactly what we actually did purchase.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out how it currently functions and, what things probably should start to change if we're going to evolve it into the future. And so we have been in a little bit of a holding pattern for the last 6-7 months because that's always been part of the plan. And now we are finally starting to implement some of the things that I feel that are necessary for the future.
Right.
And they're not big changes. In fact, most of the changes are probably going back to the basics of what made Slow Twitch unique and special. Because I feel like over the last couple of years, it maybe has gone away from some of those things. We got caught up in things that at the end of the day just don't really matter to our community. They're kind of interested, but also too, it's just, where we gather information.
Right.
We wrote an article about this a couple months ago about just race results. It's like, okay, we're going to write a bunch of information that's on other websites. I just kind of felt like that was a regurgitation of information that was already out there. It wasn't special.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you bring up a couple of things, right? Like in terms of the due diligence process and that trust, right? Like at the end of the day, our audience trusts us to be really authentic and really independent, right? Like that is our core value, and that does not change no matter who owns the site, right? Like that, because without it, like Slow Twitch is not Slow Twitch, right? Um, and like
Yeah, not to interrupt you, but that was, there's a couple of things that I thought I knew before, working with Dan in the past of just, taking pictures and putting galleries up on the site and, and then purchasing the site. I thought that we were the gold standard. Now I know that we're the gold standard. I thought that Dan had the biggest influence in the sport through the forum. Now I kind of know that he does. Um, and those things are extremely important to honor and to hold to a high standard when it comes to what do we do with that information
yeah,
and that almost responsibility and stewardship of how do we lead this community to help grow the sport and how do we feed it the information that it needs and also that helps it thrive moving forward.
yeah. I mean, I have brought this up in kind of some phone calls with you over the last 6 or 7 months that you know we have a certain obligation to our readership, right? Like we have an obligation to ourselves in terms of like defending what that brand really means, and how it impacts everything. So, um, as we continue to go forward and grow, like that's the question that we're always asking ourselves is like, how does it impact the brand? How does it influence the direction that we really kind of want to go? And when it comes to race reports, right? Like th- the vast majority of race producers today kind of want to be their own news cycle, right? Like they want to send out their own stuff.
Everybody
And
does, including athletes. Like professional athletes are their own journalists these days.
um like when it comes down to how do we fit into that ecosystem, right? Like at the end of the day, it needs to be an experience that we kind of can feel in order to then be able to convey that message appropriately, right? Like that's part of the reason why we did such a strong pivot on the number of events that we're covering and the way that we go about doing it.
And just so that people know, what is that way?
Um, so, uh, one, if we're going to choose to cover a race, more often than not, we're going a lot narrower and a lot deeper, right? So take uh 2 weekends ago, right? Like the only race that we covered was 70.3 St. George. Um in part because we could do a really good job previewing that field and talking about the storylines of those athletes and how they might interact and what we might see on race day. And then we had you know the ability to actually watch that event take place live, um and be able to write a really good story off of that, to because like both Sam and Jeannie, like those are really good stories in terms of who won those events, right? Like, and being able to put that into words and to be able to actually, you know, hear interviews after the race with these athletes, right? Like the entirety of that package meant that we could then um, put together content that made a lot of sense that otherwise you could not get anywhere else,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Well, I think it also helps too the relationships that we have with not just Ironman in general, but the PR team at Ironman, the communications team, and the relationships that we have at BCC who are doing the broadcasts, and
yep,
we're able to essentially be there live while not being there live,
right.
and that helps us put an honest, unique spin to the race report than just reading a press, release
Yeah,
and trying to look at, timing splits throughout, the event as they go on, which is, one of the reasons why we didn't cover, some of the earlier clash races this year is because it wasn't live streamed and we weren't there. And so it's like, how are we going to cover that race honestly?
yeah, and I mean, like we can't authentically rewrite a press release and call that slow twitch worthy content. It's
Not
just not.
anymore. Maybe
Eh,
I think we used to be able to possibly do that because it was different back then. That was everyone's,
I mean,
information.
there
But
wasn't
now
any
it's
other
just,
way of getting the story, right? Like but that's also why, just as an example, like with world triathlon races, right? Like we're just doing the championship series,
yeah. And
right?
we're able to
Be-
watch them and we're able to have that relationship with that PR team and they get us the pictures and they have questions, our answers to questions that we have before we put the story up. And, it works.
yeah, and it also allows, like as we look at who has been writing for us and everything else, like Tim Carlson is always part of the Slow Twitch family. Like his best race reports for the last 5 years have always been world triathlon events. So like let's let him loose on what he's really really good at,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of the other thing when we're looking at who contributes content to Slow Twitch, right? Like we want to have people operate within the niche that makes the most sense for them, right? Like Dan is always going to own Bike Fit. He's going to own like the best of certain bike stuff. Like that's
Yeah,
just,
Dan's gonna
I
own
mean, he
Bike Fit.
invented it, right?
Yeah, he did, right? And he's gonna own saddles, and he's also gonna, own all the little quirky stuff that he just loves to go out and find, and he's got carte blanche to go do that. I wanted, in speaking with him, you know, pre and post acquisition, it was, what do you like doing? Because whatever you like doing is what I want you doing. The
Right.
things that you don't like doing, I don't want you doing anymore because A, you've earned that right. And B, I just want you to focus on the stuff that makes you happy, because if you're happy, then you'll be able to write a lot more.
Yeah, and I mean that all it's also given us opportunity, right, with like Alex Harrison or Megan Foley, right, to do nutrition content that we have never been able to produce, right? Like we've really been able to find people who are super passionate about it and essentially let them loose, right? And like be able to produce something that's useful. Um and we're continuing to kind of like review and add people to that portfolio so that way we're really operating in kind of a broad swath of where people want to be right now.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question here, and you're going to be honest because you're that kind of guy. What are the big changes that you've seen since we've taken over the reins at Slow Twitch over the last 7 months? Have they been positive? Have they been negative? Anything that you would like to see different?
I mean, I have to copy edit a lot more.
Well, that's true because I write more, but that's
Well,
what this
not
podcast is
only
going to
that,
do.
right? But like not to go too much behind the curtain and pay no attention to them, but you know, we've reduced the number of people who can actually live post to the site, right?
Mm,
Like, which is, um, if we're talking about changes like content management systems, so we can load stuff and be able to copy edit it before it appears on the front page would be amazing rather than me having to post it for everybody.
yeah, it's
But
going to be a while.
yeah, I know. Add it to the list.
Uh-huh.
Um, but ultimately, right, like I think what we're doing is we're being really strategic in what we're choosing to talk about, right? Like we're not putting up, like a 500 word article about, XYZ, and we're not trying to like take one thing that happened and turn it into four pieces of content in the hopes that maybe we can like goose our page view numbers that way, right? Like when we choose to cover something, we're choosing to like we're not going incredibly in depth, right? Like we want to have something that fully answers the kinds of questions that somebody might have, but um if something needs to be gone deeper, either A, we've got a video that we can embed to sort of like continue to answer those questions, or B, like now we have this vehicle to be able to kind of continue that conversation a little bit. Um, so I mean, we've we're working on modernizing some of the technology and stuff that we have, right? Like
Okay, so we're going to
we
go into that in a little bit later, as far as where we're going with Slow Twitch. Is there anything else that we want to talk about when it comes to the current state of Slow Twitch, and then we're going to move into the current state of just triathlon as a whole for a little bit, and then we're going to wrap up this thing so that people don't get so bored on our first episode.
I mean, I think the thing that we talk about but we don't talk enough about is the forum, right? Like because, at the end of the day, like we have more than 100,000 people who are registered, who have Slow Twitch accounts, and a lot of people who are really active in terms of the conversations that they want to have. And not for nothing, a lot of times we get either ideas of directions we want to go in um, based on that forum, right? Like, and being able to include stuff that our users are talking about in our newsletter and everything else, like it helps enhance the overall user experience.
It does. And speaking of form, and if you're listening to this, you know, we would encourage everybody to start writing more within the form and not just reading. We actually have a surprisingly high percentage of people that write in the form. If you just look at it percentage wise, it's about 15% of our user base are very active when it comes to writing,
Right.
which is a really high percentage of people that are active. And some of these individuals, oh my gosh, man, I'm talking like 3 or 4 or 5 posts a day on average for the last 19 years. Like,
Oh,
it's
I know,
crazy.
right?
I want to give, like, we got to figure out how to give them like medals and send them to their house and stuff. So, because it's crazy how active they are. And these individuals that have been around for so long, like they're community drivers. Like,
Right.
they are there to pass on solid information. Like, they're not the ones that we kick off because they're not, jerks, and they're just there, and they help police the forum as well. Um, but you've also got a lot of people that are just scared to post, in fear that there's going to be some asshole that gets on and responds in a manner that's just not cool. So I would want to encourage people to, if you're listening, if you're on the forum, if you're not on the forum, join the forum. If you are on the forum, you know feel free to write,
Yeah.
because you know if we can't get more people to write on the forum, it's hard for us to clean the forum up. And that's a big initiative that we have, is making it. I mean, and that's been that way for years, is cleaning that forum up, where if you've got some person that's just a little over aggressive and just not a community well driven human, we don't want you on the forum.
Yeah, and I mean, two things, right? Like, one thing that always shocks people is Slow Twitch demographics wise is something like 55-45 male female, right? Like, it is not nearly as male driven as people would immediately think based on what a quote unquote prototypical Slow Twitch forum user um, thought has been. And to your other point, right? Like, we've done a lot of work on community building in terms of, like, we've been trying to weed out people who just are not acting in good faith on our forum. And, like, at the end of the day, don't be an asshole, right? Like,
Pretty much.
um, and so, like, that's something that is always going to be part of the project, right? Because, when you're dealing with anonymous forum members, right, like, you're occasionally going to have a bad apple, and our job is to make sure that bad apple doesn't spoil the bunch.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the current state of triathlon, what's your opinion on that? I hear it all the time. It's like, triathlon is shrinking and the participation levels are down, but
So,
I don't really think that's the case
I mean,
yet.
if you look at USA Triathlon's latest data set, right?
Oh, there's
Like,
some accurate numbers there.
well,
Oh
I
boy, don't even
mean,
get me
at least
started
it's
on them.
1 day and annual licenses, right? So, we're somewhere around 80 to 85% of where we were in 2019, right? So, uh, we've rebounded pretty well coming out of COVID, right? And we can't discount just how um, disruptive COVID was to the entirety of the endurance sports world, right? Like,
When was that? When did that statistic come out? Is that just recent?
that's looking at 2022 data.
Oh, okay.
So, right. So, decent recovery, right? Because 2022 was quote unquote the end of COVID, even though, like, the national emergency only just ended, right? In the
Yeah, and
States.
it'd be fascinating to, like, dive into those numbers a little bit more as far as just 1-day licenses versus annual licenses, and
S-
because there's a lot of people that still just didn't. They're still participants of the sport and they're buying things, but they didn't race because they couldn't get to the races that they were at.
Well, so and this goes back to kind of like a statistic that's been burned into my head since my running store days. Like 70% of runners never run a race, right? Like
Yeah, it's like
so
form users. They don't post.
yeah, I mean, so ultimately like I think we're seeing for a variety of reasons, right? Like whether it is economic or pandemic related or even just like location fatigue, right? Like you look at a place like St. George that's hosted 5 Ironman events in the last 18 months, right? Between world championships and 70.3 worlds and the relocated world championships and insert event here. Um, like it's a phenomenal venue, but I don't think you necessarily want to go there 5 times and over the course of 18 months unless you're someone like yourself who's local and it's part of your job. Right.
Well, I
um
didn't even go down to
I know.
St. George the last time because it was just like, been there, done that a lot of times.
um and so I think if we're looking at Ironman entries generally, right? Like we're still seeing sellouts in certain pockets of locations. Like some of the classic venues have sold out. Lake Placid's one of them. They did sell out Ironman California. But you're also seeing kind of like locations and people shift around in terms of what their priority event tends to be. Um, and so I think if we look at our entirety of the ecosystem, right, like people are still going to buy bikes, they're still going to buy running shoes, they're still going to buy certain things, but what they choose to race might be a little bit different. And I actually think that's probably healthy for everybody overall in terms of like I did not race any triathlon for it'll be 4 years this year, right? Like my last attempt at a race was Lake Placid 2019. But I've done some gravel stuff. I've done some ski racing. I've done some running. Um, I'll be going back to triathlon this year. Um, and some of that was like I had some medical stuff to figure out, and then like I didn't want to swim during the pandemic, right? Like I had to make sure that I was healthy for childcare reasons. So like I'm not going into an indoor space right now. So it'll be interesting. I think, like I think you'll see people shift around a little bit in terms of what races they choose to do. And what's more interesting, and this is part of the future of Slow Twitch, right? Is what are those things that people are pivoting to? And those are areas that we want to talk about on the front side of the site, video here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we have a little bit of a, a Starbucks issue in the sport right now where, a couple of years ago, Starbucks just started, closing all of these stores down and everyone's like, oh my gosh, Starbucks is going out of business. It's just like, no, they have the same amount of coffee drinkers. They just produced too many stores in too many different locations, and they got to consolidate those. And Ironman had too many races, and they needed to consolidate. And they're the first ones to admit that they had too many races,
And
and that
I
they need
think
to consolidate those.
and
And
I
then
think the
also too, they're not in that mode anymore where they are. At least I don't see them in that mode where they're, um, you know, bullying the small local races like that corporation used to do in the past, where they were just trying to buy up everything in order to sell again. Um, and so you've got a lot of local race directors starting to put races on. Um, yeah, so it's interesting. It's interesting. I would love to get, and I've got somebody working on those numbers, but just some really hardcore data driven numbers to see exactly where we're at right now when it comes to participation um, levels,
right.
and because I see a couple of things happening. that give me a lot of hope. And it's happened, two other times in history, right? In the 1980s, in the real estate crash, and in the crash, the economic crash, that happened, 10, 12 years ago, and then COVID, it happened as well. And that was, generally speaking, the individual that's in triathlon tends to fare pretty well during economic downturns. But what they so from a financial standpoint, they can still afford to be in this very expensive sport. But there's a psychological thing that happens with them where they're reminded what's really important, and that generally is family and their kids,
Yeah.
and they also feel a little bit. Um, they're reminded that they're grateful that they're able to do this thing, and so they want to pass that on to their offspring and or the people that are around them. And I saw this at Sea Otter. So I went to Sea Otter for the very first time just a couple of weeks ago, and um, there were 76,000 people attended that. There was over 1,000 vendors at that. And we'll get into this later, because if you go to an Ironman expo right now, it's a freaking ghost town.
Right.
But Sea Otter was just crushing it, and so it's like, you can't tell me that people aren't willing to spend money to go do an expo or go to an event, because that's obviously false. But with that said, the kids were just out of control at Sea Otter. And I was blown away. I was like, this is so awesome. Like, there's just so many kids out riding bikes. And, so then I got home, and then, like a week or so later, when I actually got home, and I went on a bike ride, and I was on a gravel bike on some mountain bike trails by my house. And over a course of an hour and a half, I passed 4 groups, at least 15, if not 20 youth riding mountain bikes. And there was like 1 or 2 parents with each one of these groups. And it just reminded me that there's still hope for newbies into the sport, because the people who are in the sport, contributing to the sport in a large way, have been reminded what's important when it comes to what this sport has done for them in their own personal stuff, and they're starting to share that. And so that's kind of what gives me a pretty good clue on that. For whatever downtrend we think we might be in, if we're careful and if we pay attention, we can really get into a really good growth curve moving forward.
Yeah, and I mean, we could do an entire episode just on like Iron Man's pivot from like North American sports and the whole like licensing versus them wholly own and operating the majority of their events.
Oh,
And
we could do a couple episodes on
oh,
that.
I
Yeah,
mean,
long episodes.
um,
Maybe we'll get Dan involved with those.
but like that goes back to um kind of the point of like Iron Man itself is a little bit in a transition period, right? Like they've been kind of diversifying their portfolio of events for a while now, and they've got UTMB. They're going to be very busy, between August and September with 70.3 Worlds in Finland. Then they do UTMB, and then they've got the Men's World Championship in Nice, right? Like back to back to back.
Well,
Um,
and then the like 100% women's race.
yeah, and I mean, it's just, it, I think what we're going to see is people may not do like 5 races in a year, right? Like, or 5 Ironman branded races in a year, but they'll do like a gravel race, and then they'll do some kind of like bike event, and then they'll do a half marathon that's somebody else, and then it'll culminate in kind of like that one big experience at the end of the rainbow, which will be like a 70.3 or an Ironman. And unfortunately, whether it's fortunate, unfortunate, like that's up to you, right? But at the end of the day, when it comes to like a 70.3 or like a full distance triathlon, like unless it's Roth, right? Like you're
Which, by the way,
probably
we are
doing,
going to this year.
which I'm super
I gotta,
excited
I gotta, I gotta
for.
buy my
Right?
tickets. Felix, I'm gonna email you today. I'm gonna let you know the dates that we're coming out. But yeah, we're gonna. In fact, we're gonna be broadcasting Roth on our homepage this year.
Which is, like speaking of future stuff that we're really excited about doing. But, like outside of Roth, which is like just this incredible experience, right? Like more often than not, people are going to choose an Ironman, right? So, like, as a race director, like, I'm always like, okay, I want to do something different because if I try to compete with them, like on like doing like a generic 70.3 or something, I'm going to lose, right? Like, it's not going to win. So, how can I be different?
Yeah.
Um, and like that's always the question that we have as Slow Twitch for ourselves, right? Like, is how are we going to be different? And like, I think that kind of neatly puts a bow on what are the things that we're doing in the future here with Slow Twitch as we go forward.
So, all right. So, Ryan, we've got the current state of Slow Twitch, which is we've been in a quote unquote a holding pattern for the last 6 or 7 months, and we've been pulling all of this data, and we're kind of in the same boat as the sport in general, and that is we're just kind of warming up to back to usual business. Now we've talked about how we've got a lot of you know new people coming into the sport, and when we're changing some things from a Slow Twitch perspective on how we do our reporting and articles, let's talk a little bit about what things that we're doing differently moving forward when it comes to those things on the homepage and then also in the forum.
So, I mean, from a homepage perspective, right? Like, we're really trying to pay attention to how the, average to, slightly above average triathlete, like, would really kind of care about something, right? So, when you talk about, like, let's use bikes and what Dan really kind of emphasizes, right? Like, at the end of the day, fit always comes first, right? So that's why in
At least it
every
should.
in every single one of his articles, right? Like, he's really talking about how's this bike fit? Who's it going to fit? Like, and writing within that context, right? And it's the same with any kind of other product review that we might be doing. Like, what's it like to live with as, someone who's a little bit of a geek, but like I'm not Dan. I am discount Dan, right? Like, I like certain things.
You're different, Dan. You're not
Yeah.
discount Dan. You're different,
I
Dan.
mean dollar store Dan.
There you go.
I mean but you know, when we're looking at how we can tell that story, like, it might be better served by a different way of doing it, right? Like, when you did the gravel bike review series, like that, it wasn't just written content because you excel at, being more visual, right? And so, you know, from both the quality of the pictures that we take to producing an actual video, to be able to tell the story of what of that particular product. Um, you know, I'm going to be able to write. I can take photos. I'm going to be better here, but like, don't ask me to produce a video because I'm not going to be like, I'm not the expert at it,
I won't.
right?
I trust
And,
me, I won't. It'll make me cringe.
right. And that's, you know, at the end of the day, we want people who can be a little bit of an expert, but also like, take that experience and be able to write it or talk about it or produce a video about it in a way that is not super demanding in terms of being able to get through it.
Right.
Um, because that's always the challenge when you're dealing with, tech or something else, right? Like, is it relatable?
Yeah.
You know, when it comes to our electronics reviews, like, we're not DC Rainmaker, and that's okay. Like, if you want, a 10,000 word article about the latest Garmin device, like, that's like, go
Read the
read it
manual.
when go read Ray, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but like, if you're looking instead for, like, the average guy, like, that's what Brian Gray's really good at.
Yeah.
And so we're going to continue to use him.
Yeah. And I think we're going to try to do a better job at what I call is, bringing it down to kindergarten level as well. And we're probably going to get some slack for this for, some of the super big tech geeks, but I don't really care. Because at the end of the day, what I want is that anybody that reads an article, particularly a product review article, they're able to walk away with something that they've learned.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you've got to start way at the bottom. You can't, particularly with all the new people that are coming into the sport that we've captured through COVID and or just youth that are bringing up in the sport. I think our next polling is actually going to be, in fact, I'm going to get Dan to change it today, is, how many people actually know how to change a tire? Let's just forget about, the difference between like hookless and, tubular and all that. It's, do you even know how to change a tire?
I,
And,
I
and
mean,
because I would imagine that a good percentage of the people don't, my wife doesn't know how to change a tire. I mean, she's just starting on her journey of, you know, being on a road bike. She fell in love with indoor cycling during, COVID. And, so we got her a bike last year. She rode it once, was super nervous. And this year she's been on it like 6 or 7 times already. And, we start slow with things. Even though she's been in clipless pedals on her stationary bike, for 2 years, like, we've got flat pedals on a road
it's
bike, and
yeah.
so one side's flat and the other one's like an SPD. And so, you know when she gets, her courage up, she'll attempt, to actually clip in. And we just do loops around a park here,
Yep.
locally. And yesterday we went and we did 45 minutes together, and it was just loops around the park. And we worked on cornering and speed, and and she doesn't stand up when she goes up the hill at all. She sits. And so just little things. And she's not allowed to use the big gear. She's only allowed to use the small chain ring. And but when it comes to the articles and the things, we've got to take all of those people into consideration, as well
Yep.
as the people that have been in the sport for 10 years and they're looking for that one feature on the device that that they can just completely geek out on.
Yeah.
And so, moving forward, we're looking forward to kind of getting back, what I consider to be getting back to our roots of in-depth product reviews. But we're just going to do it a little differently.
Right.
We're, instead of the 1980s calling for article reviews, it's going to be 2023, and there's going to be a visual component to it. There's going to be tech, articles written within that. And the great thing is that, a lot of people don't know this, but, well, they do, because they try to buy it. It was hard to get product in the
Yeah.
last couple of years. I mean, it was really, really challenging. But now that supply chains have eased up, and that, there's stuff on, we're in that mode of, like, I mean, I got 10 things I've got to get to that have been shipped to the studio here, just from a product review standpoint. And so, really looking forward to, working with, our partners closely with all of their stuff.
Yeah.
And then just the things that we find that are not partners, but we just dig, and or we feel like the community needs to know about a particular product. And
Right.
that's what Dan was always good at, yeah, we've got our partners and that stuff that we do our reviews, and we've got a lot of stuff going on there. But then there's just things that we just see, we're like, that's really cool. I really
Yeah.
want to talk about that.
I mean, it brings up kind of like that hydraulic brake line switch it, which the Coup bike now comes with, right? But like being able to take the front end apart of one of these super bikes and be able to swap things around without having to rerun and rebleed hydraulic brakes, right? Like because I've worked on bikes for 15 years and
Yeah,
like hydraulic brakes are above my pay grade, right?
sure.
Like just not something that I'm going to be able to do. So like him finding that is like a game changer for, my next round of bikes. And then, like to your point, like tire changing has changed a lot just recently, right? Like, and I admittedly had to send my bike to a shop because the tubeless valve like would not seat. And as it turns out, the valve itself was bad, but it's like I can't tell you how many hours I spent and how much sealant spewing out everywhere, like trying to get this one thing done. And it's just like, how do you do that in the wild, right? Because,
Yeah.
like I was lucky enough that I was trying to deal with it at home, like as a maintenance project, but like
Yeah.
imagine that experience when you're out doing 100-mile ride, like just you'd throw your bike.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've got really big plans when it comes to those types of things. I've been talking a lot with Dan and a lot of partners and non-partners in the industry. Zip, Envy, Cadix,
Yeah,
Shimano. Some of those companies are partners, some are not. But we're going to be working with all of them to help anyone that comes to our site and anyone that's part of our community understand what those things are, the differences of them, and why they would want to pick one or the other for whatever
right.
region they live in or wherever they ride. Um, so, well, we're starting to get a little bit long winded. I feel we've got good plans for the podcast. Ryan, are we gonna do this every week, every other week? What's the goal?
So I mean, the goal is for us to be able to release, I think, every Thursday going forward,
All
right?
right. Yeah.
Um, like occasionally we might have a little bit of a break depending on what our respective travel schedules look like and everything. But we're going to do our darndest to get something up on Thursdays for you to be able to listen to.
We should be able to do that though, because we're not, our podcast isn't, and this isn't, ragging on anybody, but it's not dependent on like what we did that Saturday or, that weekend. And so we're going to be able to have some, just some boring filler ones that are pre-recorded that we can slide in there as well. Evergreen is what the marketing
That's the
people
correct
call it.
term. Please.
Yes. Yes. Some
Boring.
evergreen podcasts. Yeah.
Yes. Let's make sure that people don't want to listen to
Yeah.
episodes. That sounds great.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you're still listening, we want to thank you for listening to us today. Ryan is a wealth of knowledge. We're very excited to be able to retain him as the editor in chief. We don't have any plans on doing anything other than keeping him around on the site. We're being guided by Jade, who has produced many podcasts. She was doing this. I think it was the Zwift podcast for a really long time. She was an introduction from Jordan when we were talking about doing the podcast. So she's actually listening to us. She's giving us thumbs up, thumbs down. When we mess up, we clap a couple times. She takes it out. If Ryan swears too much, she edits those. If I swear too little, she puts them in.
Outstanding.
Yeah, it works. So we will be releasing this Thursday, and we're recording next week as well. So thanks everybody for listening, and we look forward to continuing on this.
Thanks, everybody.